Hey, so today I wanted to talk about your Mayflower ancestors, and you have two lines of them coming down. And so before I go into specifically what the lines were, let me first just generally talk about the Mayflower in general. So I covered it a little bit at Thanksgiving, but as you know, there's just countless books about the Mayflower, lots of great YouTube videos you can watch on the Mayflower. The Mayflower, they're not the first people that came to America, but they were the first people that came to America for religious reasons, who fled religious persecution. So the Mayflower, the passengers on board they were not Puritans. Now, Puritans believed in a purer form of the Anglican Church. So in England at the time, if you had not sworn your fealty to the Anglican Church, you were under persecution. Now, so Puritans wanted a purer form of the Anglican Church. They felt like it had been corrupted by the Catholic Church too much, and there were lots of things they didn't. They didn't like all the vestments and all the ceremony, and whereas the Pilgrims were separatists. They were completely separate from the Anglican Church. And first, the members of the Mayflower had tried to make a go of it in the Netherlands, and it just didn't work out. So then they decided to try for America. And so they came back to England from the Netherlands, where they had stayed for a short while, to sail to America. Now, aboard the Mayflower, it was a 100-foot long ship, and aboard the Mayflower there are approximately 140 people. So about 30 to 40 crew members and about 102, I think it was, passengers. And it was cramped. It was very cramped. They had planned to make the trip with two boats, but one of the boats just was deemed not seaworthy. So they ended up jamming the whole bunch of them on one boat. So that's why they were so crowded. And with that overcrowding of people also means that they did not really have the rations that they should have, that they would have had. Had they taken two ships, they would have had more room for more provisions. But because they just decided to push on and because they were also, it was getting late in the year, and they just decided, look, we got to go for it, we're just going to have to do this thing. And so they were not properly provisioned either. So it was overcrowded and not properly provisioned. And then so they leave in September of 1620. They leave England, Plymouth, England, and they start to make the voyage across the Atlantic. And it's in the second month at sea. It ends up taking them 2 to 3 months overall to make the entire journey. But in their second month at sea, they are caught in some brutal storms for a very long time. And all of these storms and all of the waves crashing knocks out all the caulking, all the chinking in between the timbers of their ship. And so it's just seawater just constantly pouring in. And so conditions are cold and just wet. They're damp always. They're wet and damp always. Everything's wet and damp. They're sick. It's unsanitary. We've already talked about how they didn't have enough provisions. So it was not a pleasant place to be aboard this ship. The fact that they only lose 2 people on the voyage is actually pretty amazing, I think. You would think that they would have lost more, but they ended up only losing 2 people. And when they arrive, when they see land for the first time, they see Cape Cod Hook. And they realize they have come too far north. They were aiming for the Virginia colony, but they had just, over the Atlantic, they had gotten off course, and they ended up hitting America too far north. So they tried for several days to fight their way against the winds to get down to Virginia, and they just couldn't. I mean, they tried for several days to do it, and they just couldn't go against the wind. There were storms. So they ended up turning around and just going ahead and going back to Cape Cod, which is where they decided to go ahead and land. Now, but before they went ashore, they were aboard the ship, and they realized that because they were no longer going to go ashore where the Virginia colony was, they had planned to go under the Virginia colony, which was under a charter from the Virginia Company, if you recall. And so there was going to be a government of a sort set up. Well, now that they were on their own, so to speak, off in Massachusetts, trying to settle in land where there was no existing government, or they decided to go ahead and anchor offshore in Cape Cod, anchor offshore and create the Mayflower Compact, which was a basic form of governance for what would become their colony. And they do that. And all of your ancestors signed, well, I shouldn't say, not the women. The women didn't sign. The men signed. And it would only be, the I guess, not crew members say, well, I take that back. But it would be the higher members of the crew, I should say, signed it. And not the entire male crew. And so they signed the Mayflower Compact, and your male ancestors, both of them, signed it, and then they came ashore. One of your ancestors, John Alden, is purported to be the first one to step foot in America that was aboard the Mayflower. Who knows if that's true? But, okay, so they make it ashore after this horrible voyage that takes months, and they finally make it ashore, and so remember, they left in September, so they arrive in November, December, and it is right in the middle of a horrible winter, and they lose more than half of their numbers in that first winter. In that first winter, half of the pilgrims die of sickness, and they also end up dealing with Indians, but more than half of their number die of sickness right in that first year. So it was a very, very harsh environment. So getting to your specific ancestors that were on board the Mayflower, let me talk first about John Alden and Priscilla Mullins. Now, John Alden was about, I think he was around 20, 21. Yeah, about 21, when he was hired on in England to be this ship's, as part of the Mayflower crew, to be the ship's cooper. Now, a cooper is basically a barrel maker. So he was the ship's cooper, but he had other skills. Like when he came to the Plymouth colony, he would also be a blacksmith, and he was a good carpenter. But he was hired on to the Mayflower as the ship's cooper, and he was hired by the Mayflower Company because they set up a company to make this venture. So he was hired by the Mayflower Company, and he was given the option when they arrived in Massachusetts, he was given the option of either sailing back to England or staying and making a go of it in the colony. So he stayed, and he ends up, he and another guy, Miles Standish. He and another guy, Miles Standish, are roommates. I mean, they're bunkies, so to speak. When they get to the Plymouth colony, they are roommates together, and there aren't that many single gals of marrying age around, but there is a girl named Priscilla Mullins. Now, Priscilla Mullins was also on board the Mayflower, and her whole family died in that first winter. That first harsh winter, so she was the only surviving member of her family that was on board the Mayflower. Now, Miles Standish, this whole story, this whole romantic story would be told in Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, which was called The Courtship of Miles Standish. Now, that's it's a poem in the same way that, the Iliad, the Odyssey are poems. It was published in book form, and it was quite popular in the 1800s. Longfellow published it, and Longfellow published it as based on a true story because he was a descendant of the Aldens, and actually he was also a descendant of your other ancestor that was on board the Mayflower, John Howland. But anyway, So Longfellow wrote this poem based on kind of family lore that he'd always grown up hearing. This story had been passed down in his family for generations, and it was the story that he ended up calling The Courtship of Miles Standish. There's even been a movie made about it, but the Courtship of Miles Standish tells the story of John and Priscilla Alden. Now, what happens is these two guys who are roommates, John Alden and Miles Standish, Miles Standish asked John to go and talk to Priscilla Mullins about, to court her. And so John Alden goes and talks to Priscilla on behalf of Miles Standish, and she ends up falling in love with John Alden. And so John Alden and Priscilla Mullins end up getting married, and kind of Miles Standish is sort of jilted. But the story is about that, and but also about just the difficult life in the colony at that time period, and about being attacked by Indians, wars with Indians just in the first couple of years, and just the hard life that the Pilgrims had in the beginning. But even so, Miles Standish and John Alden actually were very good. Their families were very good friends, and they were in the Plymouth colony for a few years. And then John Alden and Priscilla, his wife, and Miles Standish and his wife, he ended up marrying another woman, they moved and founded Duxbury, Massachusetts. So, and I think it was when John Alden died, there was, or maybe it's the reverse. I think when Miles Standish died, John Alden was the one who kind of handled the estate. So in any event, their families were very close. So the fact that John Alden ended up marrying Priscilla didn't put that relationship, didn't put that friendship back, it didn't cause that friendship to die. Okay. Now, so John Alden and Priscilla Mullins, they ended up having about 10 kids for sure, because I remember it's the exact same number of kids that John Howland and Elizabeth Tilley have. But so they each had 10 kids. You can see how there's so many Mayflower descendants, because these people were just like rabbits. So anyway, John Alden, like I said, he's a blacksmith. I mean, boy, these guys in this time period, they wore many hats. I mean, John Alden was a surveyor for the highways. He was a deputy. He was treasurer for the Plymouth colony. He was assistant to the governor of Massachusetts twice, for many years, actually, a long time, decades. Deputy governor. And he ended up being the last male survivor that signed the Mayflower Compact. So, one of the Miller family, so Lawrence Dismukes Miller, this would be the brother of Mary Gardner Miller. Lawrence Dismukes Miller his line is registered with the Mayflower Society, and his number, just if anybody's ever interested in this, because I'm sure that if you trace your relation just back to that point, then you've got your Mayflower Society all taken care of, and you don't have to try and track it back any further. But so Lawrence Dismukes Miller, and thank you, Margaret, for providing this. He is Oklahoma Mayflower descendant number 487. So that's in case any of you want to join the Mayflower Society at some point. The other ancestor that you guys have, and this one I spoke about at Thanksgiving, but that's John Howland. Now, John Howland was an indentured servant for Governor George Carver. Now, he was around 20 as well, just like John Alden. So John Howland was around 20 as well. John Alden may have been, yeah, that's about right. And now Governor Carver, he was back when I said that back when the Pilgrims, although they weren't called Pilgrims at the time, back when the Pilgrims were living in the Netherlands, he was the deacon for that separatist church that was in the Netherlands. Now, there's a belief that John Howland was related to George Carver because he inherits everything when they get to the colony. So even though he was an indentured servant, it's believed he was more of like his secretary, So John Howland, he is in that second month out at sea when they encountered all the storms, if you recall. John Howland goes out just because he just can't stand it. It's just horrible down below. So he goes out, and the ship is just pitching and rolling. And back in those days, so what they would do when they encountered a storm like that is they would just drop all the sails and just bob like a cork in the water. So all the sails were dropped, which ended up being a lifesaver for him because all the halyard lines were down in the water, just trailing down in the water. So anyway, the ship, a wave hits it, pitches him, and he flips overboard. And I don't mean like he catches the side of it and hangs on. No, he is tossed clear overboard into the water all the way down, and it was very close. So he manages to swim and grab hold of one of the lines that are trailing out in the water. And some crew members that saw what happened, they pull him out. So he holds onto this line, and these crew members get a boat hook and yank him out of the water. But anyway, so thank God for all of us that he survived. Now, there is a children's book that's been written about, I'll try and post it on the side, but there's a children's book that's been written about that incident. And it's a fairly, it's a famous incident, the guy who fell off the Mayflower. So he ends up, when they get to the colonies, like if you recall, they lost half of their number in that first hard winter. Well, the second winter wasn't so easy either. And they lost more. But Governor Carver made it through the first winter and then died the following year. And his wife died shortly thereafter. And all their kids had already died in the Netherlands. So John Howland ended up inheriting the estate of George Carver. Now, George Carver had been the ward, he had a ward who was Elizabeth Tilley. Now, Elizabeth Tilley's family had died in that first winter as well. So just like Priscilla Mullins, Elizabeth Tilley's family died in that first winter. And so George Carver and his wife had kind of taken her as their ward because she was orphaned. And so when Governor Carver and his wife died, John Howland inherited the estate and became her, I guess she became his ward, but she was older by that time, and as soon as she came of age, they married. So John Howland marries Elizabeth Tilley, and they also have 10 children. And as we've talked about before, I mean, there are just a ton of descendants from both of these couples. John Adams is related to the Aldens. FDR, the Bushes, they are descendants of John Howland and Elizabeth Tilley. So there's a lot of them. There's even a John Howland Society. In addition to, a Mayflower Society, there's a John Howland Society specifically. Now, John Howland would go on, and he would be quite the fur trader, but he would also be deputy governor, surveyor, just kind of general man about town. But also, now this is cool. So the house of John Alden and Priscilla, it's still around. I would love to go see it. So evidently, when was it? I think it was in the 1900s or 1800s. Here it is. Okay. So yes. So they were renovating this house, which, by the way, we can all go see if we want to. This house up in Massachusetts that was built by John Alden, because, like I said, he was the carpenter. He and his wife built this house, and it still exists today. So, and it's maintained by a society. So when they were renovating this Alden house, which probably has to be done frequently, during the middle of the restoration, they found hidden underneath the floorboards or something, or in the wall, they found an old musket that belonged to John Alden. And now that musket, which is the only known firearm to have crossed on the Mayflower, is in the NRA Museum. There's a NRA National Firearms Museum, and that musket that belonged to John Alden's is in it. I think that's pretty neat. So, okay.